Welcome back. Today, we're diving into the wild ride of Bitcoin. What started as this radical outsider idea born from a financial crisis is now literally being written into the laws of nations. So, how did we get here? Let's get into it. It really all boils down to this one simple but kind of revolutionary question. What if you could be your own bank? What if you could send money to anyone, anywhere in the world, directly, without having to ask a bank or a government for permission? That's it. That's the core idea that lit the fuse on this whole thing. So, picture this. It's 2009, the world is still reeling from the great financial meltdown. And out of nowhere, this anonymous person or group called Satoshi Nakamoto releases Bitcoin. And they weren't exactly subtle about why. Right there, embedded in the very first batch of Bitcoin transactions, was a headline from the newspaper. The Times, 03/Jan/2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. It was basically a digital mission statement. Yeah, so you can probably guess that the establishment wasn't a huge fan. For the better part of a decade, the official story from governments and central banks was all about fear. They'd say it's risky, it's unregulated, it's just for criminals. The message was loud and clear, stay away from this stuff. But here's the thing, that warning, it didn't really work. Bitcoin didn't just survive, it exploded. And now, after all those years of living in this legal gray zone, the rules are changing, big time. The outsider is finally being invited inside. Okay, so to really understand this massive shift, we've got to go back to basics for a second. What exactly is Bitcoin? What's the big idea? At its heart, Bitcoin is a decentralized digital currency. And that word, decentralized, that's the whole magic trick. It just means there's no CEO, no company, no central bank in charge. Transactions go straight from one person to another, and every single one is recorded on this shared public ledger called the blockchain. Just think of it like a giant global receipt book that everyone can see and absolutely no one can go back and change. So how does it all work? Well, it might sound super technical, but the basic idea is pretty elegant. Let's say you want to send some Bitcoin to a friend. You basically sign off on the transaction with your private key. That's like your secret digital signature. Then that request gets blasted out to a global network of powerful computers. We call them miners. These miners all race to check that everything is legit, and the winner gets to add the transaction to a new block, which then gets permanently locked into that public blockchain for everyone to see. It's a really clever way to keep things secure and honest without a middleman. And when you put it side by side with the money we use every day, you really see how different it is. Traditional or fiat currency is centralized. It's controlled by governments who can just print more whenever they feel like it. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is decentralized, and there's a hard limit. Only 21 million will ever be created, period. Plus, Bitcoin transactions are final and totally transparent, which is the exact opposite of the private, sometimes reversible world of traditional banking. Now, as you can imagine, this disruptive design has led to a pretty wild and volatile history. Let's take a quick look at some of the key moments that got us here. Man, it has been a total roller coaster. It all kicks off in 2009 with that very first block. Then, in 2010, you get the first real-world transaction. 2 pizzas bought for 10,000 Bitcoins. At the time, that was maybe $40. Today, that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Insane. Of course, there were disasters, like in 2014 when the biggest crypto exchange, Mt. Gox, just collapsed. But Bitcoin always bounced back, like in 2017 when the price went nuts. Then in 2021, a whole country, El Salvador, made it legal currency. And in 2024, the suits on Wall Street finally showed up and the SEC gave the green light to Bitcoin investment products. And this shift from this fringe internet money to a real financial asset, it's happening everywhere. To see just how this plays out, let's zoom in on a fantastic case study, Vietnam. So this is pretty much the starting point for most governments. You go back to 2014 and Vietnam Central Bank puts out this very stark warning. They said, look, Bitcoin is not money, it's not a legal way to pay for things, and if you use it, you're on your own. The law will not protect you. It was basically a giant enter at your own risk sign. But while the government was putting up walls, something else was happening on the ground. People were actually using it. By 2016, the country's first Bitcoin ATM pops up. A year later, you see a crack in the ice. The government actually approves a plan to think about a legal framework. And then in 2022, a huge step. The Vietnam Blockchain Association is officially created. Now there's a formal bridge between the crypto world and the rule maker. And this slow, decade-long thaw, it all built up to this one pivotal moment. On June 14th, 2025, the National Assembly passed the Digital Technology Industry Law. And this wasn't just a big deal for Vietnam, it sent ripples across all of Southeast Asia. And here's what that law does. As of January 1st, 2026, crypto is no longer in that legal gray zone. It's officially recognized as a type of property, and it's protected under civil law. This is huge. It brings clarity to everything from taxes and ownership to making sure digital contracts are enforced. I mean, the government went from warning people to stay away to literally writing crypto into their law book. Now, Vietnam's story is fascinating, but it's not happening in a vacuum. It's actually the perfect example of a much bigger trend. All around the world, governments are finally moving from confusion and ambiguity to taking real action. So why the change of heart? Well, for a lot of them, it's about getting some control, protecting consumers, and frankly, not getting left behind in what could be a whole new financial era. So here's a quick snapshot of the global landscape. You've got countries that are pretty open to crypto, like El Salvador or the US. Then you've got places like China with really heavy restrictions, mostly because they're worried about money leaving the country. There are still a few places where it's totally illegal. But look at that last category, evolving. That's the biggest and fastest growing group. Countries like India and of course Vietnam that are right in the middle of building the rules from the ground up. You know, Europe was actually way ahead of the curve on this. All the way back in 2015, their top court made a huge decision. They ruled that swapping Bitcoin shouldn't have a value-added tax or VAT. That was a massive step because it meant they were treating it more like a currency than a taxable object, which just made it way easier for people to use. Over in the United States, things were a lot slower, but now they're really picking up speed. In 2025, the Genius Act became law. This was the first time there were federal rules for stablecoins, those digital tokens that are pegged to the dollar. And that's a really big deal because it brings some much-needed guardrails to a multi-billion-dollar market that's a key bridge between old money and new crypto. And then there was this bombshell. In March 2025, the SEC dropped its long, bitter, and very expensive lawsuit against the crypto company Ripple. For a lot of people in the industry, this was a signal that the era of regulation by lawsuit might be ending and that a new phase of clearer, written-down rules was beginning. And that kind of predictability, that's exactly what big businesses need to see before they'll jump in. So, wow. After this whole journey, from an anonymous idea on the internet to the halls of Congresses and parliaments around the globe, where are we now? What does this all mean for the future of money? At the end of the day, it all kind of comes back to this one number, 21 million. That's it. That's the total number of Bitcoin that will ever exist. In a world where money can be printed into infinity and inflation is always a worry, this idea of something that is provably scarce, well, that's a really powerful concept. And that brings us right back to the beginning, to Satoshi's original reason for creating this thing. He wrote, "The root problem with conventional currency is all the trust that's required to make it work. History is filled with breaches of that trust." Bitcoin was supposed to be the alternative, a system that runs on math and proof, not on trusting institutions that have let people down before. Which leaves us with this final, kind of ironic question. Bitcoin was built to be the outsider, right? The challenge to the traditional financial system. But now, that very system is pulling it in, regulating it, and adopting it. So what happens when the revolution becomes regulated? Can it even be a revolution anymore? That's the big question we're all waiting to see answered.